Hello again, sword friends. We're going to do something fun today. We're doing an all-European straight sword special. So I have a bunch of very sharp, very pointy swords, and we're going to test just the thrusting on them today. Now, I do have my standardized penetration test, and some of these I have already run through that, others I have not. But that test is done indoors, and I'm outdoors today because the weather happens to be good, and it's scheduled to be either rainy or snowy for probably months to come. So I'm taking advantage of the fact that it's going to be good weather and I want to do some outdoor testing. So I'm going to be continuing to use pumpkins, and I happen to have a bunch of swords. So let's just go through them real fast. So on loan to me still is an Albion Gaddhjalt from my friend Chris. Thank you very much. So this is starting off at the early period of the medieval period. So this is an Oakeshott Group 1 sword. So it's I believe this is a 10A style sword. It's a little flexible, a little bit more rounded on the tip, and very long and pointy, but not super duper pointy. Next to it, we have slightly shorter, another 10A style sword, but very different type of cross section. This is an Albion Oakeshott. This is my own Albion, and I'm very curious to see if the difference in cross section will make a difference. The fact that it's hollow ground with these kind of prominent ribs on either side of the fuller will make any bit of a difference. It's a little bit stiffer, but not significantly. It flexes at kind of different points, and it's got maybe a little bit more rigidity towards the end. Moving over, representing the long swords, we're moving over to the Albion, or rather the Oakeshott Group 2 swords. So this is a Type 15 A, I believe. This is a Balaur Arms Italian, a 15th century Italian longsword, made by, again, Balaur Arms, and it's produced by LK I believe, is the forge that produces it. And it's pretty pointy towards the end. Now, I haven't talked specifically about classifications. I'm going to flash a graph up here on the screen. Maciej Kopcio has been taking the time to systematically go through and create basically a typology for just the tips of these types of double-edged swords during the medieval period. And it might be neat to start, as we start collecting more and more data on the relative thrusting ability of swords, to be able to cross-reference and see how swords of different types of tips perform if that, just like I measure weight, just like I measure blade stiffness, to see if the type of tip makes a difference. Because in my experience, it does come down to that tip geometry, what makes the biggest difference. So this has just come in from my good friend Kane Shen. He's kind enough to let me borrow this. Thank you very much, Mr. Kane. This is an Albion Castellan. So this is really a very short longsword. I would consider this a bastard sword. Different people will have different terminology. And this is a Type 15A. And we have a very pointy tip here on the end. So we'll see how that does. And then in from Eric Estland, we have representing the Type 18C group, possibly a 15A as well. I think he calls this an 18C. So this is kind of like the Alexandria Arsenal type, his group, the Fang of Caerbannog. So what are we going to do? We're going to start just by putting a rather dense pumpkin. This pumpkin that I have is pretty dense up on the stand. I'm going to be one-handing the sword and thrusting it into the pumpkin, and the idea is that the sword is going to stick into the pumpkin some degree and hopefully not push it off the stand, because if I give it a good thrust, it's going to start sinking in, and eventually it's going to meet enough resistance that it's either going to start to jostle the pumpkin off the stand or just start scooting it back. And at that point, it will refuse to go in any further. So we're going to measure exactly how far it goes in, and that should be consistent. So as long as I'm thrusting reasonably the same amount of speed and strength, we should be able to kind of consistently see how far each of these tips goes into a pumpkin that's not braced against a wall, because if I put it against a wall and just go, huh, all of these swords are just going to go straight through the pumpkin. That's not what we want. If that is successful, then maybe I'll ramp it up. But you never know with these tests. I've been fooled before. So let's take these swords out and see what they can do. Okay, I'm mostly going to stay out of frame. This is a very, very dense pumpkin. We're going to start with the Gaddhjalt that is reasonably round-tipped. Let's see how she does. All right, so scooted the pumpkin back a ways, and we'll measure the amount of slime that made it on the tip. Oh my goodness, it's stuck. Let's see if I can do this without cutting myself open. Oof. All right. So the Gaddhjalt made it to 12 centimeters into the pumpkin. Next up, the Albion Oakeshott with its hollow ground. All right. Come on, baby. This is getting harder and harder. I picked a very dense pumpkin, and as the swords are going in deeper, you can see one of the dangers of thrusting into a target, depending on what materials you're going through, not necessarily just flesh and bone, but if you're going through something denser types of armor, leather, even metal in some cases, you really run the risk of getting your point stuck. All right, Mr. Oakeshott. 15 centimeters for the Oakeshott. Next up, the Balaur Arms Italian longsword with its very pointy tip. I think we have achieved stabbing. My goodness. So again, the group 2 of Oakeshott's blades are blades that you start to see in going from the 14th and 15th century, where it becomes more of an issue of trying to find gaps in plate armor and using that pointy tip to be able to penetrate the mail and textiles underneath, whereas there are fewer people on the battlefield that have very limited amounts of armor, where the broad tip that's better in a cutting sword is really important. So I suspect these next swords might do quite well on this test. It's also coming out easier. That's interesting. Whew. I think that has to do with how tall the spine is. "20 centimeters. Next up, Albion Castellan. And this one is most obviously a spike because it's just coming down to a triangular point, and that's even apparent when you turn it sideways. It's a very thick reinforced tip. Great if you have to bang it into a visor or slip it into the gaps between plate armor before you can reach the mail underneath. Let's see what it does to Mr. Pumpkin. Okay, I'm going to stop right there. Remember how I said that this one was the armor breaker? Look at what happened to the pumpkin up top. I don't know if you can see it, but this one has caused a fissure that's run through the entire pumpkin. I'm not sure if we've achieved more depth, but it is a bit of a thicker blade than the other ones that I have. So we'll try to see it, but it's definitely caused the pumpkin to lose integrity. Okay. 18 centimeters. So not quite as much as the Italian, but it hit with a lot of force, and it hit with enough force that it must have hit right on a cleavage line and caused the pumpkin to fracture. That's funny. We'll have to strike tangent to that line if we can. Oh, the pumpkin's wobbly, so I can't... Be all the way on the other side? There we go. Stable pumpkin. Okay, the type type 18C from Eric Ustland. And this definitely has more cutting power than the type 15A. I have to go back and check what type Balaur Arms says theirs is. It might be a type 18 as well. Okay. Oh, yeah. She's stuck. Move. Come on. Don't get hurt. There we go. All right. "15 centimeters. All right, now we're going to do something just for fun. We're going to put textile in front of the same pumpkin and give it another stab. I don't have any more blue jeans that I'm retiring, but I did have this lawn ornament that died. So this is just nylon, polyester, some sort of synthetic material that's incredibly thin and should be reasonably easy to perforate. And I've wrapped it several times, so we probably have 5 or 6 layers worth before you reach the pumpkin, and it's not completely flush, so there's a little bit of a gap there. I have no idea how the swords are going to interact with it, but maybe this will change. Which sword comes out in front? No idea. Let's see what happens. It might fail on the first try. It might just cause none of them to penetrate and my pumpkin to go rolling off, and then it won't work. But this is what science is all about. Let's experiment. What's your guess? Place your comment now. Now, if we are successful with any of the swords, I will measure how much pumpkin juice is on the blade just as before. I'm not interested how deep they go into the outer layer of cloth. I am interested how deep they penetrate into the target. That will again show how much the armor retards the ability for the sword to penetrate. Again, it does no good if the sword penetrates half a centimeter through the textile but doesn't penetrate the target. Then the armor will have been successful and will have prevented them from wounding the pumpkin underneath. So let's see what happens. Gaddhjalt versus turkey pumpkin. I don't think we made it through, guys. Gaddhjalt is clean. Let me reset and try the next sword. Oakeshott versus turkey pumpkin. Hey, we got a winner. All right. So whereas the Gaddhjalt did not make it through, this one somehow made it through. Let's see if it made any difference to our wounding ability. It doesn't feel like it based on how well this got stuck in. 10 centimeters. So that's decidedly less than last time. Huh. Interesting. And also worth noting, I can see where it went in the pumpkin, and I can see where it went in the cloth. And it's almost got 10 centimeters worth of springiness that it's going through. So there's a lot of padding that I have that it's trying to penetrate. Interesting. Balaur Arms versus turkey pumpkin. All right, we've gone through. This is very sharp. It's shredding the cloth just by leaning on it back and forth. All right. 11 centimeters. This is causing more resistance. Next up, the Castellan. Now, the Castellan is the pointiest in profile, but the thickest at the tip in cross-section. So this is a good one, again, if you have to apply a lot of power. So if you're half sorting and you're really jamming it in there, it's a reinforced tip, and it'll help you get through something very dense. But this isn't particularly dense. This is something that you want to go through very fast with a reasonably sharp tip, and I don't know that this is sharp. What do you think is going to happen? Let's find out. Oh, didn't seem to have any problem. Let's see. It's coming out nice and easy. Shoop. Oh yeah, that went in pretty deep. 13.5 centimeters for the Castellan. And finally for the Fang. Oops. Well, we pierced it before we pushed the pumpkin off the stand, and we got 11 centimeters before we knocked it all the way off. Okay, I've run the numbers, and when we put the armor in front of the pumpkins, obviously, so the one that we have to talk about first is the Gaddhjalt, because the Gaddhjalt did not go through when I put the turkey on top of the pumpkin. Is it possible that I just didn't realize how much force I needed to put on and I just didn't strike it hard enough? Possible. Is it possible that I just hit it funny and it just caused the pumpkin to shoot off? The other thing is, once it's covered, I can't see the bottom of the stand. It's possible that I didn't have the pumpkin flush, and so it was on the edge of the stand and it was wobbly and very easy to knock off. I'm not sure. So it never got a fair chance. It did seem to me, just hitting it, that it offered significantly more resistance than previously. But this is the issue with not having a proper, scientific trial. This is not an RCT. This is just an exploratory testing of a hypothesis. This is even lower scientific grade than what you'd find on Mythbusters. So this is just an idea of the basis for furthering some hypotheses. So with that in mind, how did everything else turn out? So we were seeing a reduction between 25% all the way up to 45% of penetration compared to not using the turkey on the different swords. The Italian longsword, the Balaur arms, suffered the worst. So that had the hardest time going through the turkey compared to not. Interestingly enough, though, the quote-unquote armor piercer, the Castellan, even though it wasn't going as deeply, it had the least change from when there was no armor to when armor was put on. It didn't notice the impact of armor as much. So it only had a reduction of 25%. So that's kind of interesting, that if we say that tip is better equipped for going through more resistive targets than something thin like skin, which basically doesn't offer any resistance to sharp steel, then that kind of lines up. So a very interesting comparison on the whole. Obviously, this warrants further testing, and it's kind of what I suspected would happen if I started putting different medium. Because again, I have my standardized testing that ostensibly is supposed to evaluate how thrusty or how penetrative a sword is. And in a vacuum, yes, that will tell you if a sword is more inclined to thrusting or less inclined to thrusting. But for what? Against a foam block? Against ballistics gel? Against flesh? Against hitting something hard like a bone? What if you're more interested in what it's going to do against Gambeson? What if you're more interested in what it's going to do against leather? And that's going to make a difference. If I was only evaluating their ability against pumpkins, I'd have a different idea than if I was measuring them with something in front of them. So the horse race does change a bit depending on what medium you're testing. Anyway, that's all for now. Take care. Can't just let the pumpkin sit there, right? Not too bad. I could get used to this sword. Not too bad a showing. Eric, I like your sword.